So hopefully you can see a slide. Hi everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about using Docker Compose as a Python virtual environment. So you might ask, what's wrong with things like then conda, and to be honest, nothing at all. Those are both tools that I think we're all fairly familiar with, and they're both perfectly usable and quite mature as well, tools to use to manage your Python virtual environments. There's a lot of support for them, and they've been around a long time. Using Docker as a Python virtual environment, that certainly is not a silver bullet, but I think you could perhaps say that it does offer an interesting alternative to some of the sort of more well-known and stable options, let's say, in terms of popularity. So I've just got some pros here of why using Docker might be a good thing. So the first point is just saying, really, well, you might already be using Docker as part of your local development environment, to run your web server or your database, etc. And in that case, if you also use Docker as your Python virtual environment, then that's one less dependency you have to install and worry about and manage on your computer. Also, you could end up in the scenario where your entire local development environment for a project is condensed into one file and one command, which could be quite convenient. And the last point is around the CI pipeline. So doing this potentially also means that you can have a tighter and smoother integration between your local setup and the jobs that you would run in a CI pipeline. In terms of the cons of using Docker in this scenario, so one problem is Git. You probably will end up just running Git outside of the Docker container you're using as the virtual environment. I mean, you could as well, I've put there, install Git inside that container. Yeah, I think that's obviously very doable, but it sort of leads maybe to the scenario where on each project, you've got different Gits installed inside your container, and whilst you might use the same version of Git all the time, it doesn't really feel like Git. It doesn't feel like the version of Git is something that would normally vary from project to project. Sure, things like your Python version, that might be different from one project to the next, but it does feel maybe a bit unusual to have Git be a dependency in that sense and have the version change as you change projects. Usually it would be just a global application. And then, so the second point is around some extra configuration. So I think most of us, we've customized our bash prompts to show things like, well, the Git branch, the name of the virtual environment, perhaps, some colors as well. Also to show maybe the current working directory. So all these things, they certainly don't come for free when you use this method. There's also it's also going to require some extra configuration around developing on local Python packages. So say you have a third-party dependency and you would like to maybe just put some logs in, pretty simple use case. You want to put in some logs to see exactly how your code is interacting with that third-party package. If you just had a more traditional virtual environment, you could do pip install -e path to the well, normally what you do, if it's a third-party package, you would do a git clone first, assuming it's open source, and then you would do a pip install -e path to wherever you cloned it, and then you're sort of good to go. You can't really do that. It's not so easy with if you're running inside a Docker container. So a couple of ways around that: you can mount volumes into the container. So there you would put your third-party package into a location on your file system that can be mounted into your container, and that already creates a problem because Docker context means that you can't see files, you can't see all files on your computer. You can only see up to the root of where the Docker file is. So it means you're forced in this scenario to put that library into your actual project folder, which is not very nice. And then I've put here a final point about possibly another workaround is making files in one container accessible to another container. I don't actually know if that's possible. I've not looked into it at all. But if that is, then yeah, that could also be a way around this. And yeah, so this final drawback I just put around Git pre-commit hooks, because yeah, I don't think, again, you won't get that for free, and you will have to put in some work to get that up and running, probably more so than in the case where you're using, say, Conda or Vend. So that's a sort of a summary of sort of some pros and cons of this method. At this point, we're going to switch and just sort of see it in action, I guess. So here, I'm just, I don't have anything set up. I'm just in a certain path on my local computer, and I'm going to run this command here. So I've chosen demo3 because that's the name of the repo. So often you might find on projects that the name of the virtual environment will be the same as the project repository name. So a couple of things to note straight away. On the prompt, you can see it's got a username. So that username is set via an environment variable. Sorry. And if I should be able to, well, yeah, I think it must have been clear. I ran the clear command, sorry, that's why earlier. But the point is, before I ran the Docker compose command, I set this environment variable, which is where the name Jim comes from. So you can see the name Jim. You can see that the name of the service, demo3, that's also in the prompt, and you can see you've got the current working directory, and you can actually see also we're not running as root here, which would be the default in the container. We're running as the user Jim. So in effect, this is our virtual environment now, and we can do things like we can lint our code and to sort of show that in action. Let's say here, that. So it works as you'd expect, and we've also got some tests. We've got PyTest also installed as part of the virtual environment, and if we look at the test, which is here, we can see that if this should fail, and yeah. Okay, so those are some of the things you can do in the environment. Let's just run the full. So the command I ran there to activate the environment, docker compose run demo3, that just runs the demo3 service. So we don't actually have our web server set up. So actually, I should say this is just a simple Flask app that's been set up in this repo, and the idea is that this should be serving something at this address. It's not running at the moment, so if we run docker compose up, so that starts. So I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that this sort of pseudo virtual environment, it runs independently of the rest of your Docker Compose services. You can start it and stop it. You don't need to have Docker Compose up for the other services running as you do that. But now the web server is running, so you should better go into here, and that's up. And yeah, this just returns the square of the number, so fine. Yeah, so that's the, again, oh, one other thing in terms of like customizing the experience, so to speak, inside this shell. Obviously, it's not the usual one that you're in locally, but you still get some nice things like the colors, because you're probably remembering that. I think by default, when you open a shell session in your Docker container, you don't get the colors of the folder names when you do ls. Similarly, also, you might have found sometimes when you do control up, you can't get the previous command, which is quite annoying as well. That's actually that can be just worked around by opening a bash shell rather than a bourne shell when you go inside the container. But yeah, so I think we can sort of get the idea of what that virtual environment sort of behaves like. It's probably just worth quickly going through what the repo looks like. So we've got this package demo3, which I guess contains all the application code, if you like. So there's the square function. This is the root for the endpoint, and you can see, yep, it's just using the square function. You then have your tests. So yeah, sort of as you would expect. We've got the conf test here, and that's empty, but it's just so that you can run PyTest directly rather than Python-m PyTest, for example. This is the Docker Composer, so this is probably more interesting. We've got two services. We've got the web service, which was what's responsible for the web server, and which is why we could go to localhost 5000. So that is just running off the Dockerfile in the project root. We've got the ports, and we're mounting our application code into the container so that we have the live reload. And then, yeah, this is the actual, this, I've called it demo3. That's the so-called, that's like supposed to be the virtual environment. And yeah, so it runs off a different Docker file. There's that developer name. So that, that's probably going to be most relevant if you say, if you've got multiple people working on the project, they can all set this to be their own name. We've got this for the colors, and similarly again, we've got a volume mount so that, yeah, you can sort of fix your linting errors as you'd expect. You don't have to rebuild the container each time you make a change to, say, fix a linting error. So for the web service Docker file, yeah, pretty much very standard. Just got some pip installs to do, exposing the port, and it just runs Flask. This is probably the most interesting file in the repo in terms of the virtual environment. So you can do things like set up Vim, for example, because by default, you won't have that inside the container. This DNS utils is just so that this is what is responsible for getting the name like that, because by default that will show the container ID, which is a lot less human friendly. This part is around setting up the user. So yeah, as I said earlier, the user is not root inside the container. It's the user created, its username is that developer name that you set. And yeah, it's just giving them like a home directory. So it just makes it a bit more sort of normal in terms of users. This is possibly one thing that isn't so good. This is to do with the user ID. I'm not sure if this is a problem on Mac, because on Mac, Docker does not run natively, as I understand. There's some kind of virtual machine between the local file system and what happens inside the container. But on Ubuntu, as in a way you could say, Docker runs sort of natively on Ubuntu. And this UID is just to ensure that you don't get locked out of your own folder when you're inside the container. And this ID actually just has to correspond to the ID of the user that owns the folder being mounted from the host into the container. But yeah, I'm just explaining what that is. And then yeah, so you've got this just to get your PyTest and Flake8 to work nicely. We've got our dependencies installation. Here we actually, set the user, so we're the correct user. And this part is responsible for customizing the bash prompt. So you can see all that's going on here is that value is exported as PS1, and I guess it just shows you can sort of customize it as much as you want. So, in theory, say you did have Git installed as well, you could customize this line and get the Git branch, for example, to show. And the last two lines are just so that you get a bash rather than a Bourne shell when you start this virtual environment container. And it just means you don't have to pass in anything. You can just do Docker compose run name of my so-called virtual environment. So that's that. And I think the last point to finish up on is just quite an interesting one, because it makes use of a paid feature. So it makes use of a feature of PyCharm that's only available for paid users. For users that pay. And if we look here, that's around the project interpreter that's being used. So if we look here, we should be able to see that, you can see the interpreter is this, it's called a remote Python 394 Docker Compose. And you can see, because of that, it knows where Flask is. So that's quite neat, I think, because, those dependencies aren't installed anywhere locally. They're only available inside the Docker container. But PyCharm is managed to, detect that. And if you follow to where this, dependency lives, you can see, if you hover over here, that might be a bit small, but it basically says it's under a folder called remote sources. And you can just see that PyCharm has linked up your interpreter to be what's in the Docker container. And as I said, that feature is a premium feature. So I thought I'd say that, because I don't want to missell people and then they install PyCharm and they go, oh, actually I can't do what you did, but you do have to pay. So I think that's everything I wanted to say about this. So that's it, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Guy. Does anybody have any questions? Well, I've got a question, actually.
Sure.
If we go back to I think it was the Dockerfile.
Yep.
And you were talking about that. Sorry, no, not the Dockerfile. Not that one.
This one you mean?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Sure.
And there's that user ID. Does that potentially present a barrier if you're working with multiple different?
Yes, and that is a very fair question. Yeah. And I guess the barrier it presents, I mean, maybe if I can show on my local, if I exit the thing, I think I can do that. So I'm user Guy, and you can see Guy has ID 1001, and you can see also that I think the owner of demo 3 is Guy. So that basically means then that the user you create in the container, their ID has to match this ID here. So that is a problem, in the sense that that number obviously is not necessarily going to be the same for every developer. So possible workarounds for that. One is that you sort of say to people, oh, if it isn't the same, then you can just create a user, like in my case, I could create a user called Guy Demo 3, for example, locally, and give them the ID 1001, and then then it should work. Maybe there's a way to use the groups as well. I'm not sure. I haven't really got a clear sort of picture of that, but yeah, maybe you could do something a bit better using that. But yeah, that's the sort of workaround, let's say, I thought of for now. If you did have to make this work for multiple people. You know.
Could you not also pass in the user ID like you pass in dev name?
Yes, that could also be done. Yes, I guess so. Yeah, that probably is a better solution. Yeah, I don't see why not, because this is just hard coded here. Yeah, so you could pass in the user ID as well. Yeah. Cool. I think then, if that's all for questions, I guess I should stop the recording.